In this episode of the Physical Education Podcast, we're going to talk about the practical steps you need to apply and understand in order to restore proper energy balance. Check it out. So in last week's episode, I broadly talked about the topic of energy balance. And as I said, it's literally the most important thing that you need to understand. It's this mechanism that underpins all healing in the body and proper function in the body. So if you haven't listened to that first, you need to listen to that now before you proceed with this episode. Today I'm just going to try and keep it a bit shorter, a bit snappier, and give you just the main things you need to try and apply in order to get going, because the last episode was mostly sort of informational. It was more about your understanding and less so about what you can physically do. So just to kind of go over one point that I went over, and it's basically to do with your liver glycogen. So I mentioned that your liver is sort of like your battery pack. And what we need to do in order to keep stress hormones low is to keep your blood sugar levels stable. And the way we do this is we ensure that the liver has a steady supply of glycogen or sugar. So glycogen is just a stored form of sugar, and sugar is sugar. You get it from, it's carbohydrate basically. So your liver, you can think of it as this sort of battery pack, and when it runs out of stored glycogen, what happens is you release stress hormones in order to convert fat stores and sometimes muscle tissue into glycogen. So this is often mentioned as quite a positive thing, and it's this, it is quite a good adaptive capability that the body has, and it's this ability to survive even if you don't have a steady supply of glycogen. And this is, like I said, it's a great adaptive mechanism, but it's better to be thought of as a plan B. So it's great, but it's not your plan A, it's your plan B. It's not your ideal way of using energy and relying on energy. So when this happens, when your liver runs out of energy, supposing it's not replenished, you will release stress hormones and you will convert fat stores and muscle tissue into glycogen in order to keep going. Like I said, that's fine in the short term. It's fine as an adaptive mechanism, but it's something that we don't want to do in the long term. Now, what can happen as well is, it's really important to understand, is that if you've been stressed for a very long time, your liver's ability to store energy is going to be impaired. So a healthy person might be able to go several hours without eating, in between meals, because their liver is able to store the right amount of glycogen, and it's able to manage for a longer period of time. But if your liver is impaired in any way because of the chronic stress that it's been going through, it might only be a couple of hours before you run out of energy stores, and you need to kick in that plan B, which is going to increase the stress hormones. That's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid that plan B as much as possible. Again, it's more of a survival mechanism. It's not ideal. So we want to minimize that. We want to minimize the stimulation of stress hormones in the body. So the way we do that is to make sure that the body has a steady supply of energy, a steady supply of food, and you sort of have to play around with that, the frequency. You have to begin to track things and begin to get a sense of how your body's doing, and we're going to talk about that later in this episode. But again, just to kind of give you that overview of the liver as this sort of battery pack, and that's our ideal way of getting energy. And when that runs out, we have a plan B, which is great, but it's not ideal. And particularly when we're dealing with any kind of chronic health issue, we are by definition dealing with a chronic stress issue. So we want to minimize stress as much as possible and give the body an opportunity to heal, which is going to happen when stress is low. So let's talk about ideal meals. So your meals all should have a mix of protein, fat and carbs. And as I mentioned in the last episode, you want to eat foods that are generally easy to digest. So we want digestion to be a fairly easy process, because the more effort and time your body is putting into digesting the food, the less it has to do other things, more important things. So there is this trend to kind of want to eat foods that are tough to digest, because there's this mentality of we want to earn our calories, we want to earn the energy that we're consuming. But that adds stress, and we're already dealing with excess stress because we're in chronic pain, we're dealing with some sort of chronic health issue. So we're already stressed, so it doesn't make sense that we want to add more stress. So we want to make sure, particularly when we've been dealing with chronic stress of any kind, that the foods we're eating are easy to digest. They're rich in nutrients, are very nutrient dense. So that's the point I made about kale. Kale does have nutrients, but it doesn't have that much in it. It doesn't have much in the way of energy. A lot of vegetation and certain leafy vegetables don't have a lot in the way of actual energy. They don't have a lot of calories, which again is often put forward as this positive thing. We want our food to provide us energy because we're investing a lot of time and energy and effort into extracting that energy. So if we're doing that, if we're putting in a lot of time and effort and we're not getting that much back from the food, then it's a net negative, and we want to have a net positive effect. So as a general rule of thumb, what we want with every meal is to have a balance of protein, fat and carbs. And what those are, now the levels, that's going to depend. You kind of have to play around with that. Some people do about 20% fat, 30% protein, 50% carbs. I don't know, I think that's where the individuality comes into play. When it comes to human beings, you need to play around with your specific needs and how you're feeling and where you are on your health journey. So that side of things you kind of need to figure out for yourself. But generally a high enough proportion of carbs, if you can tolerate them, is going to be better. And some people debate about that, but your body needs a lot of energy, and if we want to keep it safe and we want to make it feel safe, we want to make sure that easy energy is available. We want to make sure then that the fat is there as well to give that slow digestion for certain things, and also because the body needs fat for tons of other things and needs protein for tons of other things. But broadly speaking, we want protein, fats and carbs in every meal. And I think at the very least, if you can't do all that, at the very least have protein and carbs. Never carbs on their own, never protein on their own, and never really fat on its own. But at the very least, if it's something minimal, at the very least protein and carbs together. But ideally have all three. And we want to be eating foods that are rich in nutrients, which I covered in the slides in the previous episode. So another couple of little things that are surprisingly helpful that you might not think about is when you're eating, you want to be eating. So this is your time to eat. This is dedicated time for nourishment. So you want to make sure that that's what you're doing. You're not on your phone, you're not scrolling, you're not jogging to the train to get to a meeting or whatever it is. You want to be committed to eating, because if you create that space, if you create that time, you're creating a better environment for you to digest that. So again, we talked about we have our fuel coming in, and that's all well and good, and it could be the perfect fuel, but we need that ability to convert that fuel into energy. And a lot of that is simply creating that environment. So you could be perfectly healthy, so you could have someone, again, perfect fuel, perfect physical condition, but if they are eating the perfect meal in their perfectly healthy body, but they're jogging to a meeting and they're stressed and they've got a deadline or whatever it is, they're going to have an impaired ability to extract the fuel from the food and convert it into energy and extract all the nutrients. So there are all these different components. So a very, very simple thing that you can do without getting too bogged down in the details is when you're eating, you are eating. That's what you're doing. You're chewing your food thoroughly. You're enjoying the food. You're not feeling guilty about the food. you're just enjoying it. You're chewing it, you're savoring it, and then once you've eaten it, you're just giving yourself at least a couple of minutes, preferably 5 minutes, even more if you can manage. But say you're a busy person, give yourself at the very least 1 minute, and I would say just commit to 5 minutes. 5 minutes following a meal, and just relax, sit back, lie down if you can, and just breathe. Just gentle breathing. Slow your breathing down. I've covered breathing in previous videos a lot, but basically what you want to do is to slow the breathing down. What you're looking for is that you get a sort of you're going to get a positive shift in your physiology. What should happen is, if you're eating the right foods and you're digesting the food, what should happen is that afterwards you feel warm and you feel calm and you feel at ease. And that's what you're looking for. So this is something I've covered before, and I'll probably cover again, so I won't go into too much detail. But something to try is, after a meal, slow things down, and slow things down until you feel that positive change. You start to feel gurgling and things happening in the digestive system. And you start to feel that kind of warm, it's a warmth in the body. It's not feeling hot. It's a very comfortable and soothing sensation. And that's what's happening there, is that your body has been provided with a source of fuel, and it has successfully begun to convert it into energy, and your body is generating heat. So that's a healthy metabolism in action. That's what you're witnessing, and that's good health, which you're witnessing in that moment, or it's a portion of good health. So this is really useful in a sort of biofeedback kind of way, where you're tuning in. How does your body react to these things? How does it react to certain foods, and so on? And you begin to build a sort of a repertoire of experiences, and you come to know yourself better. And that's always the goal with any of my content, and any of the content I would recommend, is that you're just becoming more aware and more in control of your health, and more in charge. So very, very simple thing. After a meal, take 5 minutes if you can, or just take whatever you can manage. But just, this is your life, this is your health. Put in the time. I'm sure you can manage 5 minutes. Slow your breathing down, relax, close your eyes, listen to some calming music, whatever it is. In through the nose, out through the nose, and just kind of let any tension go, and notice the positive changes throughout your body, but particularly around your digestive system. Now, next sort of thing that you want to consider is, you want to eat as soon as you wake up in the morning. So breakfast, it's not just marketing. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, because when you're sleeping, you are in an extended period of fasting. So even if you're only sleeping 6 hours, even if you don't have great sleep patterns, that's a long portion of time when you're not eating. And it's, even at that, it's unlikely that you're eating right before bed and then eating as soon as you wake up. And most people don't do that. So, like we talked about at the start, we have a liver, and it can only store a certain amount of glycogen. And once those stores are out, yes, we have a backup plan. That's fine. We're not going to die. But that backup plan is a backup plan. It has consequences. It's going to create an elevation of stress hormones, which again is fine in the grand scheme of things. We're very adaptable, but you're in chronic pain. You're dealing with some sort of chronic health issue, which by definition means you are dealing with chronic stress. Because you're chronically stressed, you want to minimize the amount of stress elevation that you experience. So if you can avoid being stressed, you need to do that. Certain amounts of stress are going to be unavoidable in your life, and that's fine, and we need that, and that's fine. But if you can avoid that, and it's perfectly healthy, and it's actually better for you to avoid that, then I would encourage you to avoid that. So making sure that there is a gap that's as short as possible between your last meal of one day and then going to sleep, and then your first meal of the next day. So what you want ideally is a very easy to digest, balanced snack close to bedtime, and you want to eat something as soon as you wake up. So what I tend to do is I make a magnesium drink, which I'll cover in another video one day. It's excellent form of magnesium, very good for muscle relaxation and just general stress reduction. I make a magnesium drink and I mix that with orange juice. And close to bedtime, I will usually have a snack. I'll usually have some high quality ice cream with something like applesauce or jelly. In the US, I think you call it Jello. Basically, it's gelatin, not jam, and it's fruit flavored. And I use a high quality ice cream like a Haagen-Dazs, which is just made of eggs, sugar, vanilla, cream. I'll have that close to bedtime. It's a very easy to digest snack. It's something that I can tolerate. Maybe you can't tolerate it, so you'll need to play around with that and play around with your options. But the point is, it's balanced. It's got protein, fats, and carbs. Very tasty. So from a enjoyment of food, mental health side of things, it's great. It's sort of like an indulgence, but I don't think of it that way, which I think is important, to not think of these things necessarily as treats, but you're just enjoying the foods that you eat because you enjoy the foods that you eat. But you eat something like that, you have protein, fats, and carbs. Sometimes add a bit of salt, because that's good as well to keep stress hormones low. And if I wake up in the middle of the night, sometimes I'll wake up to go to the bathroom, I have my juice, which is about 60% orange juice, 40% high magnesium fizzy water, and I'll have a gulp of that and go back to bed, and that's going to help me replenish my liver glycogen stores so that I can go back to sleep. So what tends to happen, and also then when I wake up for the day, depending on what time that is, I will have another kind of gulp of the juice and then go down and I'll have my breakfast as soon as I can. But I can't immediately eat a full breakfast, so I'll have a little bit of juice just to kind of give that quick, easy glycogen to quench that stress hormone surge, and that's a really nice way to reduce stress hormones and improve your sleep. So I mentioned that sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night, and it's quite a common thing. You wake up around 3 or 4 a.m. Sort of quite regularly, and that coincides with this natural cycle of hormones and this natural spike in stress hormones. And you'll wake up often to go to the bathroom, and the reason that happens is because your liver glycogen has run out, and so your stress hormones have gone up, and you've also burned through a lot of salt. Usually you'll burn through a lot of sodium to deal with that, and so in order to rebalance the amount of sodium in your body, you have to get rid of extra fluid. So because you have you have the what's the word? The solution, the mixture of salt in the water, sodium in the fluids of your body. When a lot of salt is used, the salt content goes down, but now you have a high level of fluid and a low level of salt. So to balance that out, your body will release excess fluid to match the appropriate level of salt, which is what you have. So you'll often need to go to the toilet in the middle of the night to balance that. And it's because an elevation of cortisol and adrenaline will burn through a lot of your sodium. So another thing that you can do is have a bit of a high quality sea salt and just pop a tiny bit on your tongue to help quench that stress hormone release. What I do with my orange juice is I'll usually have a bit of salt. So I make batches of the magnesium water, add a good bit of salt. It doesn't really taste, so it's very diluted, but I add salt, add my magnesium, and then it's orange juice and the magnesium water. I drink that, so I'm getting all the minerals and I'm getting the sugar, and that's keeping the glycogen stores up. That's going to get me through the night if I'm struggling to do that. So that's a really, really, really common pattern, is that waking up in the middle of the night, pretty much always at the same time or roughly around the same time. And that's basically because your liver has this impaired ability to store enough energy. So it's not at that point yet where it can carry you through the night without an unnecessary surge of stress hormones. And what you will have then naturally is a surge of stress hormones towards the end of the night, which is going to help you wake up. And that's fine. And that's sort of part of your natural cycle of hormones. And it's not to say that we never want to have that. but we still want to keep that as minimal as possible and make sure that the liver glycogen is replenished. So a very, very simple thing. I personally like to do orange juice with a magnesium mix that I make myself. I can share resources on that, and eventually I'll make a video showing how I make that. And I use that as soon as I wake up, and if I wake up in the middle of the night, and then as soon as possible I'll go down and I will make my breakfast. I'll usually have some fruit. I'll have a good quality cheese, usually a lot of fruit early in the morning, and then I'll have some eggs, and that's sort of my first breakfast. And so there I have a nice balance of easy to digest carbs from the fruit. I have a good quality fat that's nutrient rich, so the cheese, and then the eggs as well. I'm getting my protein and fat mostly from those two, and then lots of fruit. And so that's something for me that I find works really well. And again, you're going to have to play around with this and see what works best for you. But that has those three main components, the three macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbs. And it's also very easy to digest. And some of that is somewhat personal. So the cheese, you might not do well with cheese, so you can play around with that. But that's what I do, and that's what I find very beneficial. And I find it's a good place to start because it's fairly benign stuff. But yeah, you want to make sure that you're eating as soon as you wake up, having a snack close to bedtime, things like fruit, milk and honey, hot chocolate. Again, these are going to depend on if you tolerate dairy, but play around with that. Protein, fat, and carbs, easy to digest, something you enjoy close to bedtime. Having the snack in the middle of the night if you wake up, something to have as soon as you wake up, and then making sure that you have a good breakfast early in the morning. You really enjoy it, and then you take 5 minutes after your food to just aid in that digestive process, because what happens is that requires a lot of energy and blood flow. And if you start doing other things, if you say, on the worst case scenario, you have to jog somewhere, your body is having to use more blood at your extremities in order to get you where you need to go. And that means that digestion kind of goes on hold, or it's impaired. So again, it's this idea that there are all these components. You could have the perfect fuel, you could have the perfect health, but if the environment or the circumstances are less than ideal, you are not going to be able to fully extract all of the energy and nutrients from the fuel that you're providing. So we have to balance all of these things. We have to make sure that the food quality is good. We have to make sure that, maybe we're not that healthy yet. So that's going to be a challenge in and of itself, but we can maximize these other things. So we can make sure the fuel is as good as possible. We can make sure that we're creating the environment that's going to optimize the absorption and conversion of fuel into energy. And so the way we do that, again, is dedicated time to eat. Really, I think I mentioned this, but I'll say it again if not, is to really, really thoroughly chew your food. So digestion begins in the mouth. It begins when you start chewing, when you start releasing saliva. There are enzymes that begin to break down the food. And so again, you can imagine you could have the perfect food, you could have the perfect health, you could even create the perfect environment. So you're relaxed and everything. But if you didn't chew your food thoroughly, then it could be a hunk of steak in your belly versus a really mashed, already partially digested and broken down piece of steak. So there's a difference there. So digestion begins in the mouth. It begins with chewing, with the release of saliva. So you want to make sure that you're chewing food thoroughly. You want to make sure that you're enjoying it. And then once you've eaten, you want to make sure that you're giving your body just that head start on digestion, because it's going to have to do other things and you have to go on with your life. But let's give it 5 minutes to just kind of settle in and get that going. So hopefully that makes sense. Then the other thing is, I mentioned that you want to be eating frequently enough. So you want to make sure that you have this steady supply, but you also don't want to eat too frequently, because there's this whole kind of reflexive sequence of events that begins from the ingestion of food all the way to the excretion. So from the moment you eat it to the moment it's gotten rid of through the back door. And if you're still in the process of digesting something, and then you begin eating again, you're disrupting that whole cycle. So it's this whole chain of events that happens as a reflex. It's this hardwired thing in the nervous system that happens. And so if you are in the middle of digesting something that's hard to digest, and then you just start snacking on other things, you're making it harder for your body to digest that first meal that you had. So you want to make sure that there is a reasonable gap as well between meals, and that's going to vary based on the type of meal. So if you have a couple of grapes and a little bit of cheese as a snack, you don't necessarily have to wait, a full 2 hours until your next meal, particularly if you feel hungry. But if you have a big, a steak, mashed potatoes, whatever, a big hearty meal that's nutrient dense, but it's going to take a bit of time to digest, you want to make sure that there's at the very least a good 2 hours in between that and your next little snack. I think there's different numbers on that. I've heard up to 3 hours it could take for that whole process. But the point is, ultimately you want to kind of pay attention and feel where you are. And so you're going to get to know that as you engage with this process. But as a general rule of thumb, yes, we want to eat frequently enough based on your needs, but you don't want to be grazing too much, because that can also impair your ability to digest, because you will be in the process of digesting one meal, and then when you start on another one, that kind of gets paused and the whole chain of events begins again. And so what's still in your stomach from the first meal will only resume properly when this new piece of food reaches that point. So there is this reflexive cycle that takes place, and we don't want to disrupt that by grazing unnecessarily. Another thing that's worth understanding is actually that cravings are very, very intuitive. We tend to, it's a funny thing, because if you feel tired, or if you feel sad, or if you feel all sorts of emotions, you don't tend to be skeptical of them. But there's a huge amount of information online that kind of encourages you to doubt feelings of hunger. They'll say, you're hungry, are you? Maybe you're thirsty. Maybe you're just thirsty. And within this, there is this sort of implication of, are you sure you're not just being a bit too greedy? And it's really arrogant. And I think there's a degree of truth to it, but it's really arrogant to think that these signals that come from a highly, highly complex and intelligent body that we don't fully understand, there's this arrogance in assuming that these things are purely random and greedy, and you can just trick your body out of being hungry. Like your body generally knows what it needs. Now you can kind of lose touch with perceiving that, but cravings, like craving something sweet, craving something salty, craving something bitter, things like that, things that are really specific cravings, are very good places to start, because your body is telling you, I require something in that realm. I require what I'm giving you the craving for. Now you need to use your own judgment with this. So there isn't a physiological need for a donut, but there is a physiological need for sugar. So you kind of need to use a certain amount of common sense. So that's what I mean, where there's a certain degree of truth to this. Are you sure that craving is what you think it is? So when you get that craving for donuts, maybe it's that you're not eating enough carbs, you're not getting enough glucose, sugar into your body. So you need to make sure that you're getting that. So making sure that you're getting your fruits, and sometimes you can crave more textures, and so you can play around with getting those textures, so crunchy things or soft things or mushy things, saucy things, making sure that you're getting those, but preferably getting them from healthier sources. And of course there needs to be some degree of allowance and being able to enjoy food. And there's huge value in being able to eat food and not be bogged down in the guilt and whatever, and just eating food and enjoying the experience and going to a restaurant and eating what you want and making that an event, not being so orthorexic about it. So yeah, it's very important to listen to your body, to listen to these cravings, and to not punish yourself, to not think that your body is trying to trick you. Your body is trying very hard to keep you alive. And we understand this in any other context, we get that. But then it's odd that when it comes to things like food cravings, there's this air of skepticism, your body might be trying to trick you and sabotage you. So it's worth considering that and making sure that that's not happening, and that you're honoring your cravings, but you're honoring them in a way that makes sense, because healthy foods are healthy foods. We know what those are. But it just might be that you're not eating enough. So the reason why you get these cravings for these bad foods is because you're not eating enough overall. And this is what we're going to get into next. So in the last episode, I talked a bit about the amount of calories you should be consuming. And I didn't mention specifics. I just mentioned that, for example, in Auschwitz, they had people cut down to 17,000 calories, I think, per day. And that by today's standards wouldn't be considered low. And it's very interesting because we need to be able to look at the culture of diet and culture of health and where we get our information and various trends. And I mentioned a book that recommends an 800 calorie diet. And so you might have been left sort of a bit confused, like realizing that, okay, that's low and that's far lower than what they had in Auschwitz. And I guess that's bad, but so how much do I eat? So that's what we're going to talk about. What you want to do is you want to be able to calculate your daily caloric needs. Now, the only the best way to calculate this is with a machine. I forget the name of the machine. I should have checked. I'll include it in the notes. But it's basically going to measure the amount of carbon dioxide that you produce, and it calculates your metabolic rate at that time, which helps you determine how much you need to be eating. They're quite pricey, they're quite hard to get, so it's unlikely that you're going to use that. But that's the most accurate way, and I will link to that in the show notes and the resources if you're that interested. But what you can do is online you'll find a lot of daily caloric need calculators, your resting metabolic rate, it's called. And basically you put in your weight, you put in your height, you put in your age, your gender, and you put in your activity levels. And that can be a bit hard to gauge, but you should have a sense of, am I fairly active? Do I do a physical job? Or am I sitting at a desk all day? That kind of thing. So in any case, if you're unsure, you can try different settings and get a ballpark. So the point is you're going to input these data, and you're going to come up with a number. And that number could be 2,500 calories, it could be 3,500 calories, whatever it is. Now, I know that some people would actually argue against this. I know of people who would eat in the 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day and they're super lean, and that's when you get the body working perfectly and you get the perfect fuel and the perfect environment for that to be used. It's far too complex to do in this kind of general way over the internet. That would be something you need to do on a one-to-one basis. But it's just to kind of make the point that that's possible. The best thing we can do now is to just kind of get a rough sense. Put in the data, see what you get. Is it 2,500 calories? Whatever the number is, get that number. And then what you can do is you can take an average day or an average few days of eating, say a week, track what you're eating, get something like a MyFitnessPal or a Chronometer. These are apps that you can log the foods you're eating, the quantities you're eating, and it'll give you a total breakdown of how many calories you're eating, how much protein, fat, and carbs you're eating, and the breakdown of that. And you want to compare what you're actually eating versus what you roughly should be eating, which is that calculation of the resting metabolic rate. So you want to compare the two. Hopefully there isn't a major difference between the two. So if there's a difference of 300 calories between the two, I wouldn't worry about that too much. You might want to, if you're eating more than that, I wouldn't worry about it as much. But if you're eating significantly less, basically what I'm interested in is, are you eating significantly less than what the calculation recommends? And that's what a lot of people will find, is that you're simply under eating. And that gets really complicated because you might be thinking, well, you're saying that I'm under eating, but maybe I'm not super lean. Maybe you have a few extra pounds, maybe you're overweight, whatever it is, no judgment. But I understand that. I understand that maybe you feel like you're not super lean, you're not in great physical shape. And I'm suggesting to you that you might be under eating, which sounds really backwards and sounds really counterintuitive. Like I said in the last episode, Jay Feldman does a great job of explaining why this happens in his series on weight loss. I think it was episode 10, but I'll link to it again in these show notes. They were linked in the previous show notes. But he explains why this happens, so we won't get into that. But for now, what I will say is that it is possible for you to be under eating and to be overweight, and the trade-off be one of health rather than one of body composition. So you keep that weight because your body is sacrificing in other ways to keep you going. So you might not, you don't look lean, you don't look as if you're under eating, but you are, because your body is compensating in a different way that isn't physically visible in your physical body composition. So again, long story short, what you want is to look at the discrepancy between what the calculation says, what the resting metabolic rate number is, versus roughly what you're eating on a daily basis. And then from there, if there is a significant difference, you want to slowly begin to move up to match roughly that number. So if you find that your calculation is 3,000 calories per day, but you find that you're routinely eating 1,500 calories per day, that's a big difference. And these equations aren't perfect, so there's wiggle room there, but that's really significant. That I would be pretty confident then that you are under eating. And what you don't want to do is then suddenly add 1,500 calories to your daily caloric intake. You don't want to suddenly double your intake, because that in itself is going to be a stress. What we're looking to do is to reduce stress. We're looking to match the demands. So in the previous episode, I talked about how you have a budget. In order to run your body, to run everything properly, based on your demands, you need a certain amount of energy. So, for example, based on your age, your weight, your gender, your activity levels, you need 3,000 calories to work properly, but you're only consuming 1,500. Yes, we want to get up to that 3,000 mark, roughly, but we don't want to suddenly increase that overnight, because that in itself is going to be a stress. So we want to incrementally increase. So the first thing you might want to do is, well, actually, this is debatable. You kind of just need to play around with this. You might want to focus on increasing the calories rather than worrying about the food quality, or you might want to first correct the food quality. So make sure that you're eating the good foods, the easily digestible foods that we covered in the previous episode. Start with that, keep it roughly around the same amount of calories, and then increase. Or for some people, it can work a bit better to not worry so much about the food quality, keep the food quality where it is, but increase the intake. I would say the best way to kind of figure that out for yourself is to go based on where you think the biggest issue is. So if you're eating fairly well and there isn't a big difference between what you're eating and what I generally recommend that you consider eating, then maybe don't worry about that too much and just focus on increasing the quantity of food. Now, if you're eating poorly, and there isn't a huge amount of discrepancy in the calories, if the main issue is that you're eating poorly, then you really want to prioritize eating better. So hopefully that makes sense, just a way to kind of play around with that. But basically I would say don't add more than like 500 calories per day of consumption. even at that, maybe 200-300 calories. So if every day you're eating 1,500 but you should be eating 3,000, don't add 500 calories to your daily intake. Maybe add 200-300 for a couple of weeks, then add a bit more, So do it very, very incrementally. And I can't stress this enough. A major issue that people have with this kind of information is that they do too much too soon. So you have to embrace the journey. You have to take your time. You have to listen to your body, but make very small changes very gradually, because it will pay off in the long run. You can do a lot of damage by doing too much too soon and changing too much too soon. So what you can do is you can get these numbers, get a sense of where you fall in that. Do you need to prioritize increasing your calorie intake? Do you just need to prioritize the food quantities? Or you might find that you're eating quite well and you're eating close enough to that number, so maybe you just need to fine tune specific foods. So the ratio, maybe you need more carbs, maybe you need more fat, maybe you need more protein. So that would be the next thing. In terms of protein, you want to consume about 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So if you weigh 70 kilos, you want to consume 140 grams of protein per day, just for well, some people would argue you need less, but I think given that you're chronically stressed and assuming that you're going to be eating good quality food, we want to go for that higher number of high protein. So find out what you are in kilograms, say 70 kilograms, double that, and that is roughly the amount of grams of protein. And I'll leave all this information in the show notes, but that in grams, so say 140 grams of protein daily, and you want to spread that. Then in terms of a ratio of protein to carbs, a general guideline is to quadruple, and you can play around with this. At the very least double, but up to 4 times. So if it's 150 grams of protein, your carbs should be roughly 4 times that, so 600 grams of carbs. That's a general rule of 4 to 1, a ratio of carbs to protein. So 1 gram of protein would be you'd want 4 grams of carbs to go with that. And so what a lot of people do is a general template. So again, I'll say, try it out, but ultimately you're the expert here, and you need to accept that and take that on board and use this as guidance rather than a prescription. What people do is they'll say you have 3,000 calories, and that's what you're working towards. Let's start with my protein. I take my weight. In kilograms, I double that. That's what I need that's how many grams I need of protein. Then I quadruple that for my carbs. So say 150 grams of protein. Then I quadruple that to get 600 grams. So those are my carbs. And then the rest is fat. So whatever that would be. So 4 calories, 24. That would be a small amount of fat, but basically what you do is you see what the remaining amount of calories are, and you make that fat. But I'll include all those equations in the show notes. Really, what I would really want to drive home is do things very slowly, small changes, nothing too drastic, in order to not really add any unnecessary stress to the body. So now that we roughly know how many calories we need to be consuming, we need some sort of way to measure. So like I said, I keep saying that you need to be in charge of this. You need to pay attention, see how your body's responding. So we need some sort of way to measure how your body's doing. So earlier I said, when you eat a meal, what should happen afterwards is you feel warm, you feel calm, you get your metabolism basically increases. So your body starts generating heat because it has fuel now that it's converted into energy, and it is able to use that energy to do work, to do healing, to do various processes. So that's a positive change in your metabolism. We want to be able to measure that. So we want to have a sense of, are the foods I'm eating, are these changes I'm making, are they having a positive effect on my health? because otherwise this becomes guessing and you're just changing things randomly and not really knowing why you're doing that. And we don't want to do that. And I know it can be tempting, but it's going to backfire. So do this the right way, from the start, and it will pay off and it'll work far quicker, even though it feels like you're working slower initially. So what we can measure, is very easy to measure, is your pulse and your body temperature. So what should happen is, throughout the course of your day, there should be this gradual increase in body temperature and pulse, and then it kind of lowers again towards the end of the day. And basically what that is your body wakes up after a period of fasting, after sleep. That's what we call it, breakfast, breaking the fast. After a period of fasting, your body is at a higher, at a point of higher elevation of stress hormones, and it's lacking energy. And when we provide fuel to be converted to energy, your body can now start working again. It can start generating heat. So it generates heat from the energy and from the use of energy. So that's a positive thing. And so what we want to see is that as you begin to add food and movement and sunlight and activity, which should happen during your day, your body will become warmer. And what will also happen in line with that is that your heart rate will increase. It won't increase hugely, but it will slightly increase in line. So we want this nice even increase and uniform increase between the body temperature and the pulse, and they will begin to drop later in the day. They will drop close to bedtime. Again, that's all normal, and there are these natural cycles. So we can measure that and we can get a sense of what's going on. What we want to do is, as soon as you wake up, measure your body temperature and pulse. So you can place 2 fingers here. Don't use your thumb to measure your pulse, because your thumb is a pulse. So use 2 fingers at your wrist. You can do it at your neck. Set a timer for, say, 20 minutes. Count how many beats you have within that 20-minute period, and then triple it. So you get the amount of beats per minute. And then you're going to use a thermometer, oral or under your armpit, whatever you can find. It's worth, if you have a number of thermometers, is to test them in different locations and to sort of cross-reference and see, are they all roughly the same? Because you can get some really different readings. So try and find the one that's most consistent, most accurate. But you're going to take your body temperature before or after you take your pulse. You're going to write those down. So I'm going to encourage you to keep a log of your body temperature and pulse as soon as you wake up, and then 30 minutes after your breakfast, and then 30 minutes after your lunch. And so what you want to happen is, like I said, it's going to be low first thing in the morning because you've been fasting all night. You have a high level of stress hormones, low level of available energy. So as the fuel is put into the body, your breakfast, and you begin to move and you convert that fuel into energy and you begin to become active and you get sunlight, that should increase. There should be this natural increase, this even increase, and it should feel comfortable and pleasant. And same again, it's going to kind of peak in that 30 minutes after your lunchtime. So this nice uniform increase. So that's what we want. And I'll give you I'll include the ranges in the notes, but the main thing is that you just track that and get that sense of what way it's going. What we don't want is that we have a sharp drop in temperature after a meal. So that's telling us that if your core body temperature drops after a meal, it's generally because your body is struggling to digest the food that you've just eaten. And because it's struggling to digest that food, your body needs to divert blood and energy to the digestive system to deal with that. So too much effort has to go towards the digestive system to deal with this food that's hard to digest. And that means that the rest of your body is going to be operating at a lower body temperature. And that's, like I said, a sign that you're not eating foods that are agreeing with you and your body is having to work too hard to extract the energy from that food. So these are the trends we want to look at. We want to look at making sure that there isn't a drop in body temperature. And also we want to make sure that there aren't any significant spikes or drops in the pulse. So what can happen after certain foods is that you can have a drop in body temperature and a shooting up of the pulse. So particularly if you tend to drink black coffee on an empty stomach, you could have actually either increase or decrease in temperature, but you know, the shooting up of the pulse, which we don't want, and that's a stress response, and it's not a healthy response. And just as that makes me think of coffee. A way you can avoid that is making sure that you're consuming coffee. If you're consuming it on its own, make sure it has a carb and fat source in it. So sugar and milk, like full fat milk or cream. It could be maple syrup, it could be honey, but a sugar source and a fat source to kind of dampen that caffeine surge. Or if you really are into black coffee, and if that's how you drink your coffee, that's fine. Make sure that you're having it after a meal. So not on an empty stomach, not as a tie you over in between meals. It's going to have a very, very different effect on your body, because caffeine is a stimulant and you need the energy to match that stimulant. And if the energy isn't there, you're going to have that surge of adrenaline, and that's is a stress hormone, and we don't want that, because we would be increasing stress, and we don't want to do that. So hopefully that makes sense. So we want to track body temperature, pulse, and look at these trends throughout the day. And really this is very much a learning opportunity for you. And initially you're writing down the numbers, and you're seeing these as numbers, and you're seeing that in this kind of external way. But the goal, what we're working towards, whether you kind of realize it or not, is that you're beginning to internalize that information. So the point we want to get to is that you get to a point where you understand what kind of response you're having to your food. So I no longer track body temperature and pulse in that way. I have a sense of them, but I understand more than anything how my body is responding. So I can tell if I'm in a sort of high metabolic state, if I'm in a healthy state, or I can tell if I'm having a stress reaction to something. And this is what we want to work towards, because it can be a bit of a nuisance tracking body temperature and pulse and all these things in the long term, and tracking your food in the long term. Personally, it's not for me. I don't do it for long periods of time, but it's good to do it for, maybe a month or two initially, to get that data and to start to understand this and to know it deep down, because this is always the goal with this kind of content and this kind of information, and ultimately what I think you need. It's a deeper understanding, like it's your own understanding. It's not this mental abstract thing. It's because you feel it. So if you're kind of put off by the idea of having to track this and track that and input that into an app, I understand it's only for a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, but it's going to serve you very much in the long term. Breathing is another thing I'll mention quickly. You'll begin to track your breathing and understand your breathing. So that's something that you can look at. What you should have, again, if we have this positive change of gentle rise in temperature, gentle rise in pulse, this calm feeling, what should come with that is even, easy breathing through the nose. And what you'll notice often is at times when you have the sharp drop in temperature, these things that we don't want, is that your breathing will become shallower. You might start breathing through your mouth. Basically your breathing is disrupted, and it's indicating, these are all indicators, these are telling you that your body is in a stressed state, which again we don't want to do. So if you want to know more about the breathing, you can check out the episodes on breathing. I've done a lot on that, but I figured that was worth mentioning because it's in that same ballpark. So the final thing you want to consider, and this is the most subjective, so everything we've covered so far is fairly objective stuff that is going to work across the board. The final thing we need to consider is subjective sources of stress. So you will know this better than anyone, but we want to minimize stress as much as possible. So I said that you could have the perfect fuel, you could have really good health, but if these environmental things aren't good, you're going to struggle to digest your food. So you can have the perfect food, perfect health, but if you're running to a meeting and you've got a deadline, you're not going to digest that as well. So you're not going to extract the energy from the fuel, and you're not going to be able to use that efficiently, and you're going to cause more stress. Similarly, if you're eating the perfect food and you've got a generally good level of health, but the air is polluted, or you're under a lot of harsh blue light, things like that, these are going to impair that ability to function properly, because they're going to add an additional stress on you, an additional thing that your body needs to deal with, when all it wants to be able to do is deal with extracting the fuel from the food and producing energy. So some of that is fairly objective: lack of sleep, lack of sunlight, too much blue light and artificial light, what are they called? Non-native electromagnetic fields, Wi-Fi, things like that. That's kind of an interesting one. That's very, very individual. If you're in good shape, good health, you can tolerate a lot of that very easily. But people in a poor state of health can be very sensitive to EMFs, electromagnetic frequencies or fields. So it's something to consider. Little things you can do: put your phone on flight mode at night, turn notifications off. That's more for just disrupting you and distracting you. Turning the Wi-Fi off at night, keeping your phone outside of the room, things like that, because they do add up. A lot of people will dismiss this and say, well, it's fine, but it's all little things that add up and add up and add up. And when we're dealing with chronic pain that we sort of don't really know where it's coming from, it's a lot of these little things just adding up, and a body that's struggling. It's just struggling, and you're just adding these unnecessary stresses. So lack of sleep, bad foods, of course, under eating, which is surprisingly common. It could also be overeating, less likely, I think. Excessive exercise. So this can be a challenging one, because we can use exercise as a coping mechanism. We can use exercise as a way of artificially raising our body temperature. So like I said, what should be happening is the food you consume should be converting into fuel easily and allowing your body to use that energy and generate heat. But if you have an impaired ability to do that, your body might rely on exercise as a way of elevating your body temperature, which is, it's fine that exercise raises your body temperature, but the fact that you might be relying on that and using intense exercise to do that sort of in this secondary way, in this less than ideal way, is a sign of some sort of underlying issue. So what you might find is that you rely on excessive exercise to make you feel better, and really what we want is that you should feel good even without exercise. I mean, exercise should feel good, and it's something that you should do a certain amount of, but you should feel good without exercise. Your body should work well without exercise, presuming that you're moving still throughout your day. But a lot of people do very, very intensive exercise, particularly steady state cardio exercises, marathons, ultramarathons, things like that. These are extremely stressful to your body, and you're going to have to kind of determine for yourself if it's too much. Now, if you seriously love what you're doing, then you love it, and that's fine, and maybe you need to balance things out in a different way. But I think there are a lot of people who use jogging, cycling, things like this, but they don't actually like it, but they do it because it's something you do. It's a way of being healthy. And I would encourage you to kind of move past that and realize that you don't, it's not actually that healthy for you. These really intense, long duration exercises that really tax the body aren't necessarily that healthy. The main health benefit you will get from them is more of a mental health benefit from the enjoyment of the sport, or maybe the community of it. And so I wouldn't want to take that away from you, but I just want to kind of encourage you to reflect on that and consider that maybe if you're doing intense exercise, if you don't enjoy it, if it feels like a chore, particularly now if you're dealing with a chronic health issue, now might be a time to swap that out for something a bit more gentle. Things like walking. Walking is an amazing exercise. I'm going to do an episode on walking specifically. But excessive exercise is something that you want to avoid, particularly heavy cardio for very long periods of time. Things like weightlifting are going to be less taxing, less stressful, and they're more sort of pro-metabolic. So they give you more of a payoff in terms of your body working healthily. So weightlifting or resistance exercise is going to be a bit better if you're purely exercising for health. You know, if you're engaging in exercise just because you're like, well, I'd feel bad if I didn't and I don't really care what I'm doing, then something like gentle weightlifting, even, you know, Pilates can be very good. So things that are going to build muscle and not tax you over long periods of time are going to be better. So yeah, they're the major ones. The subjective ones are down to you. It might be the job you're doing, the people you're interacting with, basically the things that really drain you, that trigger you, whatever way you want to think about it. You need to kind of pay attention to that and see how much of that can I minimize? How much of that do I absolutely need to go through? And what you'll find is that if you fuel the body properly, if you provide it the energy and the nutrients, you're going to be better able to deal with these stresses. But also we want to minimize those stresses as much as possible. So it works on both ends. And like I said, all of these factors are at play. But we want to recognize them. We want to see, you know, what are the toxic parts of my life, my relationships, my job, whatever it is. Find out what those are. See, can we eliminate them? Can we minimize them? Can we mitigate them in some way? It's tremendously important for you to do that. So what we want to do then is attack this from multiple angles. We want to make sure the fuel is good. The fuel we're providing for the body is as good as it can possibly be. And then we're trying to create the ideal internal environment for that to happen. So we want to make sure that we're chewing the food thoroughly. We're giving our body the best chance possible to extract the energy and nutrients from the food. We then want to allow a bit of dedicated time after eating, a few minutes, 5 minutes, more if you can, to breathe, relax, allow that digestion to start working. And what should happen then is this warm feeling, this calm feeling. You'll come to know this intuitively, but that gentle rise in body temperature and pulse as your body produces more energy and begins to work better and better and generate more heat in a comfortable and healthy way. And then we want to make sure that the life we're living, the environment we're in, the physical environment, the air quality and the sunlight and that, but as well as the relationships that people we're dealing with, is that nourishing us? Is that draining us? How much of that is inevitable? What's the best we can do with what we have? But you really need to kind of start picking these things apart and getting a sense of them. And really, you are best situated to do that. So I encourage you to reflect on that. And I've covered that in a lot of previous episodes, and I'll link to those, and they will give you resources to figure that out for yourself. But the main thing I want you to take away from today are those practical steps. Chewing your food, eating, dedicated time to eating, breathing after food, tracking your body temperature, your pulse, calculating your resting metabolic rate roughly, getting a sense of where you are versus where you need to be, and how can we begin to bridge that gap. Is it simply a matter of eating more, or should we just eat a bit better, a bit differently? Can we play around with that? These are the things I encourage you to do so that you can really begin to put these concepts into action. So resources are in the description. If you have any questions, give me a shout, and I'll see you in the next episode.